Good morning to you all again. My name is Daryl Fleary with Trivantis. And in this morning's Inspiration Wednesday session, we're going to talk a little bit outside the box and learn how we can use the randomization features in Lectora to do creative and interesting things with our titles. As I usually like to do when I start off sessions, I usually like to start with some examples just to get your mind flowing a little bit. And we'll talk about, as we go today, all the different ways that you can use randomization in Lectora to do fun things. And here's our first example, actually. As you can see, we're going to click on the Inspire logo here to display our secret message. Now, obviously, this is pretty silly, and I'm losing my patience with it as well. So we'll just click anywhere. And the secret message is, welcome to the Inspiration Wednesday session. So this is using an example of randomization in Lectora just to do something to make your title active, I guess is the right word. Let's look at some more realistic examples this morning. All of these are different examples of how you can randomize things in your title. For example, you might want to have random questions or questions that include random values to present to your students. I'm not very good at that. Let's try this one. Okay. And as you see, as I click the refresh button, it's generating different random information every time I click it. So we get a new question up here. We get new values. Geez, I'm not very good at this. New values for all of the components of the other question. There we go. Here in our cylinder question, we're randomizing here sort of days in the week or what the favorite drink might be. And as you can see, we also have a little word scramble game as well. All of these things are using randomization features in Lectora to generate on the fly a new number or new values for our questions, etc. So this is the type of thing that we're going to talk about being able to do. Now, before we get into this sort of tricky stuff, semi-tricky stuff, I want to do a little bit of a backtrack and talk about the most basic and most common use of randomization in Lectora, and that is to talk about randomized tests. Many of you may have used randomized tests in the past, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today. There are other Inspiration Wednesday sessions that are recorded that talk specifically about testing. But to do a randomized test in Lectora, what you can do, you can set up a test and put all of your questions on a different page in Lectora. And then when you go to your test properties, you can say that you want to randomly select however many pages you want out of that test to present to your student. So in the example that you're looking at here, there are 20 questions in this test, and I'm asking Lectora to randomly pick out 10 questions for the student. That is by far the most common and easily done randomizing feature of Lectora. I'm hoping some of you out there didn't even know that was possible, and you've already had an aha moment this morning. Now, a couple quick points. When you do a randomized test in Lectora, you'll notice I have a note at the bottom of the page that says you cannot have a last page and no submit test action. And the reason for that, now a last page, typically people will put, click done to continue or to see your score, or you've completed all the questions in the test, something to that effect. The reason you can't have that in a randomized test is because Lectora won't know which page is the last page. Because it's randomly pulling 10 pages out of this pool of 20, it may not pull that 20th page. So you cannot have a formal last page in a randomized test, nor can you have a button that says submit the test. What will happen is Lectora will automatically submit the test once it's pulled those, in this case, 10 random pages. Now, there are a couple ways around that, which I'll show you a little bit later in the session when we actually jump into the AWT file. But in general, you cannot have a last page or a submit action in a randomized test. Randomized test is very easy. You just put each question on a separate page and then go to your test properties and select that you want to randomly pull the pages. So now let's talk about doing some of the other things that you saw in the example and how those can get accomplished. And the way those get done is Lectora has some syntax that you can type called RAND. RAND, parenthesis, minimum value and maximum value. And what that does is it tells Lectora, I want to pick a value, pick any value between whatever I enter as the low value and whatever I enter as the high value. Inclusive. So for example, if I put a low value of 10 and a high value of 20, Lectora would randomly pick a number between 10 and 20, including 10 and 20. So on this moving logo thing that I did, all I did was put an action on here that says, on mouse enter, move it to a random x-coordinate on my screen between 50 and 690, so that's side to side, and a random y-coordinate on the screen between 150 and 620. That's all I'm doing. So anytime the student tries to move the mouse into the logo, it's going to randomly move it to another location on the screen. Now, one thing I want to point out, you'll notice that RAND must be in capital letters. And the reason for that, if I just go back here, you'll see, a lot of times in value fields in Lectora, you can put text information, right? For example, you might change the value of a variable to say hello. Well, Lectora needs to know whether you want letters for something or whether you're actually trying to perform a function. And in this case, it's a function. So RAND must be in all capital letters anytime you want to use it. And you'll find as you experiment with this that almost every value field in Lectora will accept that random value. Okay? So again, we just tell it pick a random value for our x-coordinate, pick a random value for our y-coordinate, and the result is we get this little thing moving around the screen. Now that's one way you can do something random right away. But suppose you wanted to have a value that you could use over and over, or for different things like we saw in those other examples, to add to another value, that kind of thing. Well, how do we do that? Well, the way you do that is Lectora allows you to create variables, as most of you probably know. Well, in creating those variables, you can also say that you want that variable to have a random value. So in other words, Lectora, I want you to pick the value. I don't know what the value is going to be when I start. You pick a value, and then we'll use that value in different places in our title. So let's take a look at how we do that. What you would do, you go up to the Tools menu in Lectora, and you choose your Variable Manager. Okay? And in Variable Manager, it allows you to add a new variable. And when you add that new variable, and you can, of course, name it whatever you want, when you add that new variable, you can declare that you want this to have a random initial value, and then you can put in, again, the low value and the high value that you want it to have. So again, you just declare you want it to be random and say what the values are. So then when Lectora uses that variable the first time, it's going to automatically pick a number, in this case, between 10 and 125. Another way you can do that without going to the Variable Manager, because you may not know that you need to do that to start with, is if you're doing an action like a modify variable action, you'll often see a button that says New Variable, which will also launch this similar type dialog, and you can declare that it's random to start with as well. So those are the ways you can create a random valued variable. You can do it from the Variable Manager, or you can just click on the New Variable button and do it at that time. And again, that random number will be assigned a value between and including the minimum and maximum values. Okay, so let's look at how we might use this modify variable action then to do different things. And you can modify, by the way, you can modify any variable value in your title. Okay, just pick the variable that you want and say that you want the value to be random. And we'll look at that under the hood in just a second. So let's go on to one of these other examples that we had a moment ago. So here, as you can see, every time I click the box, it's generating a different number. Well, how am I doing that? Well, we have a value or a variable that I just called value1, and I have a modify variable action that says every time I click, modify the value of that variable to be a value between 0 and 99. And then I have a second action that says change the contents of my text block so that you can actually see that that value changed. Because of course I could be using that behind the scenes in some other way and you wouldn't necessarily know that that value changed. So again, two actions on this. On mouse click, modify the variable. In other words, pick a number between 0 and 99 and then show that in the text block. That's all that's happening here. So when you saw those questions on the first page that was just showing a value, that's all it was doing. It was randomly picking a number and showing that to you. So how might I use something like this in my title? Well, you may have seen, again, on that first page, we had that cylinder example, right? The volume of a cylinder. And you've seen me use this before. Well, the reason this is an interesting question is every time I come to this page, it's going to generate new values for the height and width of this cylinder. And then by doing some math in the background, using modify variable actions in the background of Lectora, it can calculate what the volume of that cylinder is, and you can use that as a question, for example. So let me just reload this page, and you see that it pulls up completely different numbers. So we can do some really interesting things in our titles just by randomizing the values or using that random R-A-N-D syntax. Another thing I showed at the beginning of the session was I showed, well, actually I showed it, but I didn't quite describe it. So let me just point out, you may have noticed so far that every time I've done this, these values have been whole numbers, have been integers. I'll just back up a page here. Again, these are always integers. It's going to generate a number, like I said, between 0 and 99, but it's always going to be a whole number, an integer. But suppose we don't want integers. Suppose we want some sort of decimal value. Well, how can we do that? Well, there's a little trick that I learned that I can show you, and we'll do that here. Let's say we want to teach our students how to add or subtract or multiply, divide 3 decimal place numbers. So we want to create random numbers that have 3 decimal places. Well, you saw this in the beginning. Well, how did I do that? What I did here was I essentially tricked Lectora a little bit. A variable can contain text or it can contain numbers. Well, when you add numbers together, when you have an add to variable action, let's say the value of your variable equals 9, and you add another 9, Lectora says, oh, I have 2 numbers, so I'm going to do a mathematical calculation. 9 plus 9 is 18. But if you have letters in your variable, and you do add to variable, Lectora essentially builds a string of text. So what I did here was I cheated and made Lectora think that I'm building a string of text by using numbers in that string of text. So what does that mean? I did a few steps. What I told Lectora to do was randomly pick a number between 0 and 100. That's what you see here in 42. Then I added an action that said, add to that variable .x if the value isn't 0 or isn't 100. Well, x is not a number. So as soon as I put that x in the variable, Lectora now thinks it's all just text and it doesn't try to do a mathematical calculation. So now my variable contains 42.x. So then I have another action that says add a 0 through 9 for the next position. And again, because it's a string now, it's just going to put things on the end. So I just did that 3 times. So now I have 42.x334. And then I used subtract from variable, or remove from the variable, the x, which leaves me with an actual value. 42.334 is a value, a numeric value, and I can use that in calculations. So I tricked Lectora a little bit by saying generate a number, turn it into a text string by adding that .x, get as many positions as I want, and I could just copy this line over and over and over, and then once I have as many digits as I want, pull the x out, and that leaves me with a number. So it's a little bit tricky way of getting to a multi-place value, because remember, you can only generate random numbers that are integers. By the way, I see a couple messages in the chat, and I will address those later, but a couple that I've seen just want to know if there's a high end or a low end, and there is not. You can generate a random number between any two values. I think I've used 0 and 100 a couple times, or 0 and 99 a couple times here in my examples, but you could use any number you want. You could use -5 to +5 if you wanted to. Okay, so there's a little trick that you can use. Again, taking advantage of this RAND, random generator syntax. Now, I also showed in my earlier example how we were randomly selecting a drink for the party, or randomly selecting a day of the week. Let me tell you how I did that. And again, we'll go into the actual Lectora file and look at these in just a moment. Okay, so here I'm randomly picking from among these as the drink preference that I want for my party. Well, how am I doing that? It's actually pretty simple. It all goes back to choosing a random number. Well, in this case, there are 9 things that I wanted to pick from, so I just have Lectora generate a random number between, in this case, 1 and 9, and then if it comes back with 1, I change it to, say, vodka. In other words, if random number equals 1, set it to vodka. Set it to bourbon if the condition random number equals 2. Set it to scotch if the condition that the random number equals 3, and so on. So all I'm doing is generating a random number, and then based on that number, changing it to be text instead of a number. And that's all that's happening here. Just over and over, just picking a random number. In this case, it picked 5, and so it said, oh, if it equals 5, change it instead of 5 to be the word rum. Oh, if it equals 4, instead of putting in 4, change it to be the word gin. And then I have a change constants action that's displaying that to you. So in all these cases I've shown you this morning, every single time it's just been generating a random number between one value and another, and then once I have that, I can do whatever I want with it. So what does that mean? Well, that means I can do a lot of interesting things, right? If I generate a random number, let's say I have an exercise in my title. Well, I don't want all of my students to get the exact same exercise. So maybe I create my exercise, and then I just copy it 4 times, and then I change the names and a little bit of the data. And then before they go to the exercise, I just have an action on the page before that says, randomly pick a number. In this case, we'll say between 1 and 4. And if it comes up 4, go to the exercise for number 4. If it comes up 2, go to the exercise for number 2. And in this way, you can kind of ensure that your students get a lot more variety in the title. And you can actually cut down on what I like to call that hey Bob factor. In other words, hey Bob, what answer did you get? Because they won't necessarily have the exact same exercise. It may be the exact same process steps, but you just alter the data slightly, and all of a sudden, without doing any more work, really, you've got 4 different versions of your test. You could vary what character shows up on a screen. You can vary, what chapters you want to go to. You can use it to create games and things of that nature. In fact, here, I think I'll show you one. Let me see if I have one here real quick. Let me show you this. Here's a little shell game that I created for the user conference a year or so ago. And in this game, obviously, we hide the ball underneath one of the caps. Well, how do we know which cap to hide it under? Well, there are 3 caps, so we pick a random number between 1 and 3. That was easy. How did we do that? Capital R-A-N-D, left parenthesis, 1, comma, 3, right parenthesis. Once we have that value, we just said move the ball to a certain position. Well, now we're moving the hats around. How do we know which hat to move? Well, I just picked a random variable and said, pick a number between 1 and 3. If it comes up 1, move the first hat. If it comes up 3, move the third hat, etc. How do we know where to move the hats? Well, there are 5 actual places on the screen that the hats can move to. Pick a random number between 1 and 5, and whichever hat we chose to move it to that random location. If it comes up 1, move it to the first spot. If it comes up 5, move it to the 5th spot, etc. So you can use random numbers to do a lot of creative things in your titles simply by remembering this RAND minimum and max. So what I'd like to do now then is go actually into the AWT file in Lectora and see how these things actually look. So here's our AWT, and I think the first thing we did was to move around this little logo. So let's take a look at that page. Here's our logo, and as you can see on here, we've got some actions, whatever, but the primary action here is on mouse enter. Oh, where'd it go? Sorry, I've got 2 monitors here. On mouse enter, move the logo to a random position. And by the way, I said a lot of value fields in Lectora could do this. Let's say this is not a move action, but, make it a size action. So we're going to say, on mouse enter, resize the logo to a random width and a random height. That would work also. But anyway, all it would do is resize the width and height to some random value. What else did we do? We did this question here. With the values. So all we did was generate, as I showed you before, values with multi-decimal positions. Right? We generate a number, added the dot x to it, and then just added 0 through 9, either one, with a random selection for however many decimal places we wanted, and then at the end pulled the x out to make it a number again. Once we had that value for both of them, we can add the 2 of them together. Here's the list. Here we'll use the day. Again, I have a variable that I called day, and I picked a random value between 1 and 7. And then if the value equaled 1, I changed the value of the variable to be Sunday. If the value equals 2, I changed it to be Monday, etc. And then when I was done with that, I did a change contents action to say, just change the text block to show whatever is in that variable, which will now contain Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. So it just adds a little bit of variety to the title. Let me just mention the test. I talked about that earlier. Here's a test. Here's the test we looked at, and as you can see, it's just got 20 questions. And all you do, once you have your questions, one question per page, you go to your test properties, and on the test properties, on your content tab, you just say, I want to make this a random test, and I want to randomly pick 10 pages out of this test. That's all you have to do, and when you run it, we don't know which 10 pages it'll pick, but it'll pick 10 pages, and then at the end, show you results and so forth, just as always. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that when you do a randomized test, you cannot have a sort of final test page because it doesn't know which page will be your last. But there's also a way to get around that. And the way to get around that is to use a test with sections. And what you would do there is you would not randomize your test, but you could randomize your sections. So in what Lectora is going to do is going to do your first section of your test, then your second section, then your third, and so on, until the test is complete. So what I've done here, I have a section that I call required, which is 5 questions that every student will get, because it's going to come to the first section. This section is not random. They'll get all 5 of these questions. Then they'll go into the second section of the test, which has multiple questions, and this one, we can just set it to be random and pick, let's say, 5 questions out of here. So now everyone would get these 5, and then it would randomly pick 5 from here. Then it would go to the last section, and that's where I have my last page, and at that point, they can click a Done or Submit button to submit the test. So if you want them to have control over submitting the test, and you still want to sort of randomize your test, just create sections within your test, randomize the section, and then you can put an end page in its own section. Lectora will go to every section within the test and randomize the ones that you indicate as random and not randomize the ones that you indicate are not random. Hope that makes some sense to you. So really, that's all I wanted to show you today, was how to do some pretty creative things. Again, you can randomize anything you want just by using a value of RAND minimum and maximum, or by creating a variable and then modifying that variable value to a random value and then applying that however you want. Pretty cute, right? Not a lot of magic to it, not something you may use a whole lot, but it can add a lot of variety to your titles because it allows you, as I said, to point to different exercises, use different characters, change information in fields, create dynamic questions, etc. What I'd like to do now then is turn my attention over to the chat box and the question box and see if there are any questions that I can answer. Okay, yeah, there's the one question here. Well, one says, I never saw the secret message. Let me just point out, you didn't see the secret message because I got tired of trying to catch the little the logo, and the secret message just says, welcome to today's session. So it wasn't a big secret in this case. Okay, there's another question that says, I've seen people have the first and last page of a test not randomized and have randomized things in between, and that's what I was just discussing here, so hopefully that's a little bit more clear for you how I did that. If you create a test with sections, anything that's in a non-randomized section will be shown. Anything that's in a randomized section will get skipped to however many times you need, pages you say to pick. And then in this case, we added the last page. That's how they accomplish that. Can you have a randomized test that is not scored? Yeah, actually, just because you have a test doesn't mean you have to score it. A test is just a fancy chapter. So yes, you could do that, and then just in your test properties, just not grade the test. Where is it? Here. There we go. So you can still use the same features of randomizing the pages, perhaps for exercises or whatever you want, without having to score it. Very simple. Let's see what else we have here. Question is, using a random variable, can you go to a specific page? Can a random variable be linked to a page or a number in a chapter? Absolutely. and I'm just going to pick on this slide here again just because it kind of illustrates that. You could have anything in your title, anywhere in your title, and based on the random variable, you could do a modify variable action to generate a random variable, and then just have actions that say if the value equals 1, go to this chapter. If the value equals 2, go to that chapter. Let me kind of show. I guess it'd be similar to what we did here with these lists, with the drink list. So here you would just generate a random variable, right? Generate a value. Let's say you have 9 chapters in your title. Okay, so you're going to pick a number between 1 and 9, and then you're going to say, go to chapter 1 if the value is equal to 1. Go to chapter 2 if the value equals 2, etc. Right? So that's how you would do that. So you could go to any page or anything at any time just by first flipping your coin and getting your random value. By the way, I said flipping a coin. Again, that's another type of game or thing you could do, right? You could do a spinning wheel kind of thing or a roll of a dice thing, because if you think about it, a die is just a random number between 1 and 6. So you could sort of let them spin a die and pick their exercise that way. A lot of creative things you can do to make your titles a bit more interesting. Okay, let's check some of these other questions here. When displaying a random variable value, for example, a bet of 0 to 99, will any of the values repeat before all values bet? In other words, will it always pick 1 to 99 and then exclude anything that it's picked previously? No, it will not do that automatically. When you tell it to pick a number between 1 and 99, it's going to pick a number between 1 and 99. And it might pick 6, and it might pick 6 again, and it might pick 6 again. That can happen. Now, you can get around that a little bit. Let me see if I can show you that. Here in this word scramble, as you can see, every time I click it, it modifies the letters. Well, I don't want it to come up with the same letter in each position, right? Because that wouldn't exactly be a word scramble. So what I did there, and this is a little bit more complicated. Let me see if I can find that. What I did was for the first letter, I picked a random number between 1 and 4 because they're 4 letters. Okay, once I picked a random number between 1 and 4, I then ran the action group that says go to the second letter group. The second letter group picks a number again between 1 and 4, and then it goes to the third group, and the third goes to the fourth. But it only goes to the next group if the number that it picks for letter 2 is not the same as it picked for letter 1. If it is the same, I just run this group again to pick again. So that's how you can prevent it from doing picking the same number multiple times. Just have it check itself, right? Just have it check and say, oh, did I already pick that one? If so, pick again. So in this case, it picks a letter for number 1, goes on to number 2. It picks a number between 1 and 4, assigns a letter to that, has a value for that, and goes on to the third if it wasn't the same as the first. And the same thing here in the third, it goes on to the fourth if it wasn't one I already used in number 1 or number 2. So in that way, it keeps going. And then again, once it's done that, it just assigns the appropriate value. If it's a 1, put a P. If it's a 2, put an L, and so on. And that way, you can get the play action, the play word that you see here. So that's all it's doing. So in this case, it picked 1 as the first number, and then it picked 4 as the second number, and picked 2 as the third number, and picked, or excuse me, this, right? You get my math is all messed up. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, let's take another look here in the chat and see if there are any more questions. Instead of adding x to the number, could I have added random 0 through 9 times 0.1 plus, in other words. That's a great question. Certainly you could generate a random number and then do a mathematical against it to multiply it by a decimal to shift your decimal point. You certainly can do that. In this case, I wanted specifically to have 3 decimal positions because that's what I'm teaching my student. So that's why I used the X to change it to a text string and then added values after that. Now, what you cannot do it all in one sort of equation. I think you guys know that. You'd have to do it individually. But yes, I could have generated a number, run it against a decimal value to create a decimal value, and then added the 2 decimal values together. In the decimal example, can you just create 2 placeholders with a dot between and create 2 random variables for each placeholder? You can do that. That question is basically saying, could I have created a number here and a number here with a dot in between? Yes, you can do that, but this one might end up being 2, not 637, and this one might end up being something else. So again, I specifically wanted a certain number of decimal places for this example. That's the only reason I did that. But yes, you certainly could do that as well. What else do we have? I'm glad you guys are thinking. That's good. I like that. If you use sections in a test, can you grade the test? Absolutely. You just click grade the test and it will grade the test just like always. The sections just become an organizational tool essentially within a test. That's all they are. During my presentation, I was able to click and type into fields. Is that something you could show us? Yes, that is, but it's easier just to tell you. There are form objects in Lectora. Let me see if I can find that. There are form objects here in Lectora that allow you to create input fields, drop-down lists, check boxes, radio buttons, etc. So you would just add these objects to your page, and then you can use them as entry fields and so on. Those are also the same objects that get created when you create multiple choice or true false or fill in the blank questions. That's what it's using as these type of form fields. Let's see what else we have here. Can you randomize the color of an object created in Lectora? That's a great question. And the answer to that is sort of. No, you can't really randomize the color, but what I could do is have multiple text boxes, each with a different color value, and based on my random number, show text block 1, or show text block 2, or show text block 3, or text block 4, each of which is in a different color. So, like I said, you can randomize anything you want, sort of, just by picking a random number, and then use that random number to do what you want to do with it. Let's see, what else do we have? Thank you. Someone said they love the out-of-the-box theme for this session. Thank you. We appreciate that. We try to give you some things that are a little bit different than just, the standard, here's how you build a text block. On the size example, X and Y are using the width and height of the whole page correct. You could resize something to the size of the whole page if you wanted to. I'm not quite sure why you would do that. But again, you can set, using that random, or a specific value for that matter, you can set what size you want the object to resize to. There's an Inspiration Wednesday session that's recorded. Actually, no, that's not true. Let me back up. There's a how-to course on our website. If you go to our website, to the Lectora University page, there are some sample courses, and there's a how-to course on using the move to and size to action. And in that course, it talks about how you can use a random value or a specific value or a variable value for the move or for the resize. And that course is also downloadable, so you could actually download the AWT file and look at it yourself. If the learner fails the test, can he or she retake the test and see different random questions? Yes, if you set your title up that way that they can retake the test, certainly. Anytime they go to the test, it's going to automatically randomly pick however many questions you tell it to randomly pick, and there's maybe some of the same questions, they may not be some of the same questions. Again, it's randomly picking pages, so you don't really know. And again, that's the beauty of randomizing, right? They don't know what questions they're going to get, so they can't write down the answers and say, oh, I'm going to get them all right this time, or they can't share them with their buddy. Another benefit to that is, by the way, if you're doing a test that you're not using as sort of your formal evaluation, you might want to include feedback on your questions. Well, if you include feedback on your questions, they're pretty much guaranteed to get the question right the next time they take it, right? Because they've written down the answer. Well, if you randomize the test, then even if they wrote down the answer, they may not get that question again. So it's still a good instructional tool. I'm trying to watch my time also, and I really appreciate you guys hanging in there with me this morning. Can you randomize the appearance of a page throughout the course? For example, a drill exercise that appears throughout the course to keep students on their toes. Well, you certainly could. I'm not quite sure how I'd do that. I know it would start with picking a random number, and then from there, I think what I would probably do in that case is I would probably put a test, quote unquote, in my title and have a different version of the drill on each page of the test, sort of like here, and then just have it randomly pick one page out of however many versions of the drill I have, and then continue on. Because remember, a test is like a chapter. It doesn't have to be something that's scored and submitted to your LMS. You can use it simply to randomly pick some information and then move on from there to the next thing. I think you guys are getting the idea. I'm sure I'm repeating myself quite a bit here now. Good question here. In Word Scramble, in the little Word Scramble, how did I avoid showing the word play? Well, the truth of the matter is, I didn't. For this example, I didn't. I figured the odds of coming up PLAY were pretty slim, so I didn't worry about it. If they get lucky and it comes up with PLAY, then they got lucky. So again, I know this was kind of outside the box and a little bit silly in some cases, but what I really wanted to point out to you was that there's this terrific power in Lectora that most people don't take advantage of, that allows you to pick a value and then use that value in a number of different ways. Once you have that value, you can tell it to go someplace, to show something, to hide something, to play a video, to play an audio, to do whatever you want and add a lot of variation to your titles. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining today. I hope you're inspired to do something a little bit different, to play with this and get outside the box a little bit. Thanks very much for joining, and I hope you have a terrific day.